I'm pretty sanguine about it because the book is printed, and we do have these copies that we can send to a few people. You have obviously one of the 20, and we have a good pre-order set up where we have Tom set up a pre-order site, and we're working on an art print that I'm going to sign, and so even if the book is a couple weeks late, we'll generate more pre-orders and whatever. It'll all work out, but it would be nice to have it out in the bookstores on time for sure.
A lot of times I'll read a book and, it's something that can be consumed in a different media that, could have easily have been an online comic or could be read on a tablet or a PDF. This is a book that is very much designed to be a book.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that, it was done out of a love for all the possibilities you can do with the materiality of, the page turn and even holding the book in your hands. And hopefully the kind of uncanny feelings. It's a sort of a, first person point of view, a lot of the book when you're holding a book, looking at a panel of someone holding a book with something going on inside, there's like this layering effect that goes on. And it's not done particularly out of defiance. I mean, I love, I do read stuff online, and I also have no trouble with people adapting comics to movies or whatever. There are people who are real curious about like comics should like stay in their lane kind of. And I don't really feel that way, but I did in this book feel like what was fun about it and was challenging was to do kind of a deep dive on all the different ways I could maximize the materiality of comic books and books in general, and the experience of reading, the act of reading, holding a book in your hands and flipping it over to, in the service of a kind of a narrative.
It's both a testament to Scott McCloud's ability as a writer, but also the relative rarity of experimentation with the form as a book, at least as far as English comics go, that his books are still kind of a frame of reference for these sorts of ideas. It's been like probably 20 years since Understanding Comics, and we're still talking about Infinite Canvas, and that's still really the template for a lot of people.
Yeah. I think it's probably been more than 20 years at this point, but yeah, he laid a groundwork, and people have various quibbles with it and stuff. But the fact is, it sort of set up a framework in which to talk about the way comics work and the way we read them and the way we create them. That definitely continues to be useful.
Is this an attempt, in a sense, to operate similarly to that in order to, at least from the standpoint of making people very hyper aware of the act of reading a comic?
I would say yes, in the sense that I do want to make people aware of. Hey, Jessica, come and bring me some coffee. So yes, I definitely had a goal to do that kind of Brechtian, alienation effect, where you're always aware that you're reading a comic in ways that are pretty obvious because you're always changing drawing styles. And even though there are very different styles, they're all, if you know anything about drawing or look at comics a lot, you can kind of tell it's all drawn by the same person. There's no cutting and pasted or mashups in here. This is all stuff that I drew. But it's not intended to be a pedagogical book. Like, I'm not trying to illustrate a particular point or thesis with it. I feel like I hope there's a lot of ideas about, how comics work, how reading works, the joy of holding a book in your hands and reading it. But I find that whatever ideas I have about comics, theoretical, historical, whatever, I handle best when I just channel them into creative work. I mean, that's what 99 Ways to Tell a Story was as well. It's been used in a lot of classrooms, and I'm really pleased that it's become a fairly canonical textbook in comics and even like filmmaking classrooms. But when I was creating it, and same thing with Ex Libris, I was doing it with the mind of, this is a work of creation, a work of creativity that I'm challenging myself and having a lot of fun trying to tell a story or retell a story in the case of 99 Ways. It's something I've become aware of since I've been a teacher for so long. And, Jessica and I did make these 2 textbooks, Drawing Words and Writing Pictures and Mastering Comics, which are very, they're very hands-on kind of practical manuals. I see a lot of articles about me or prefaces to interviews. They're like, comic scholar or comics theorist, Matt Madden. And I don't reject that because I care about that stuff a lot, but I'm not a scholar. Like, I don't have the rigor to.
There's overlap between educator and scholar, and
yeah, sure. There's definitely overlap. But I feel where why I'm most comfortable and where I think I'm most effective in terms of what people get out of my work is the way I will make a fun kind of creative work like Ex Libris or 99 Ways, but that is kind of informed by a lot of things that I pick up going to panel discussions and reading books of comics theory, or just, looking over the history of comics and drawing in ideas from other media as well.
Does the act of being an educator and really looking at all of this stuff in the micro and macro level, I mean, is it unavoidable that ultimately is going to influence the work you make?
I don't think it's unavoidable because what's unavoidable is it's my temperament. It's what's always excited me about art and storytelling. There are plenty of people who teach who it doesn't particularly affect them in that kind of formalistic way. I think I just have an inclination from my earliest interest in art, even as a kid, just stuff that's kind of playful, it has surprises to it. Something I've been thinking about a lot in my recent stories, Ex Libris, also the short story Bridge that was published by Mini Kush earlier this year, and Drawn Onward, which was a little sort of palindrome experimental short story that I did for Retrofit. I was really thinking about how much as a storyteller I'm indebted to Rod Serling and The Twilight Zone, to Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne, these kind of little short stories that have a twist ending to them, which you also find in the European authors that I like. Julio Cortázar and Borges and people like that, and Nabokov, that have these stories that have some kind of sense of surprise or the uncanny in them. But I've forgotten where we started the question on that one.
Do you risk something like a twist becoming a crutch?
I don't think so in my case. Because like I said, it's something I'm really, I've been writing these stories myself for years. And I'm just now realizing like, oh, that's something I tend to do. And it's not every single story that I do, but it's a tendency that I come back to.
It's been unconscious up to now?
That it was such a thing that I've come back to multiple times. Yeah, definitely. Like, Drawn Onward, I was very aware of it being kind of like this sort of paradoxical story that I meant to have this sort of twist ending. And again, like with Ex Libris, it's a book-based story where you have to manipulate the book and kind of read it backwards and forwards to get the full meaning of the story. But Bridge started as a 24-hour comic, so I really wasn't thinking about it in any kind of other framework and just trying to write this thing in 24 hours, And it wasn't until later that I realized, oh yeah, that also has kind of this twist, ending to it. But other stories, it's not the case, and I don't feel like I run the risk of being falling into that particular trap of like, oh, you should read Matt Madden stuff that's full of twist endings. On the flip side, the bigger danger I risk is like, oh, Matt Madden, he's that guy who always has weird constraints in all of his work, and that's something I do. That's more of a thing that I think about, like, on one hand, I embrace it and I have to, because it's very upfront. It's what a lot of my teaching is about, talking about working with constraints and having these funny little rules and stuff. And I am aware in that context that there is that danger of it sort of coming between readers and my books. They're coming to it, knowing this stuff about me. That said, Ex Libris is not, again, I try to mix it up for that reason. So there's definitely a lot of like constraints and rules baked into Ex Libris. The overall structure is fairly straightforward narrative. It's like a person locked in a room narrative. It's sort of like, Repulsion, or, there are lots of stories like that of like somebody, or Jason Shiga's book. What was that called? Is it Fleep? The one where there's it's like a character inside a black box that's trying to escape for 100 pages. So that's a different kind of precedent that I'm drawing from in this case. So.
Is the ultimate goal when you set out and create the exercise or create the constraints to eventually sort of transcend or be able to shed them at some point in the process?
Not necessarily. No. I want to take them to a level where they transcend just being an exercise, you could say. Although I also defend the idea of having an exercise too, especially when you're talking about short comics. You can try something. It doesn't have to be much more than like showing, oh, you could do this in comics, have a story that, you can read backwards and forwards, or that, you can read the panels in multiple directions and tell different stories. That's fine, I think. With the longer work, I do have the ambition to make it cohere as a work of art by any number of, classic standards and more contemporary, conceptual standards or whatever. And Oulipo, the Workshop for Potential Literature, which has been kind of my main source of inspiration and learning about the whole world of creating stuff with constraints. Part of their ongoing debate and dialogue since they were founded in 1960 is just exactly that question. Like, if you're going to make a novel without the letter E, for example, like Georges Perec's famous novel La Disparition, which is a 350-page novel where he doesn't use E at all, except that he does actually in the middle. He snuck one in there just to see if people are paying attention. That book declares itself on every page as a constrained work of art because you're always aware of the fact that there's no E in there. But it also seduces you and you get used to its particular weird rhythm of talking, and everything, all the expressions have to be changed because common expressions have to be worked around. But you come up with new common expressions and there becomes like a new vernacular that you get used to in reading the book. And then it just becomes a book and it becomes interesting and you get absorbed in the characters and the plot, which is all these characters who are trying to find something that's missing from their life, and which they've slowly start to realize is the letter E. And as soon as they visualize it and start talking about it, they're murdered horribly. So it's got a kind of Agatha Christie mystery novel kind of structure to it as well, which I think also influenced some of the stuff I've been doing more recently, having this playfulness in the storytelling that goes along hand in hand with the constraints. In Oulipo, there's kind of a debate where some of the members of the group are like, you should always, if you're going to use a constraint like a lipogram, which is a text where you remove a particular letter or more, then your work should really be all about the fact that you're not using the letter E. And the Perec novel is a great example of that because
in terms of it almost being a meta commentary of its own structure,
without saying like, "Oh, I wrote this novel without the letter E." In fact, he's forbidden from. He can't say that because according to his own rules,
because it would require the letter E.
It's very meta in that sense that it's like built into the story. And I think why that novel endures and why I talk about it a lot is because it does manage to very much state the constraint up front in a way that's like integral to the work itself, and which also becomes the material of the plot of the novel. So that's kind of I would say that's sort of the dominant idea in Oulipo. But there are definitely other people who are like, no, you should really hide the constraint. You should use it just as a kind of creative tool, and then kind of cover your tracks. So like Harry Matthews was an American member of Oulipo, a really great writer of short stories and novels and poetry. And in his books, when you read them, you can never figure out what exactly he's done. There's no like, oh, this is a book where, every third word, has an A in it or something like that. There's always a feeling that there's some weird stuff going on, but he would go back and deliberately change stuff around and edit it so that you can't really tell what he's been doing. You just know that there's some magical, weird stuff going on, and then it makes for a very unique and compelling reading experience. I fall sort of somewhere in the middle there, I guess, because I enjoy, working with constraints, and it's been most of the comics I've done in the last 25 years have been based on some level of constraint, and all of them more or less explicit. Like if it's not stated in even the title, like I've done some comics based on poetry forms like the sonnet, and they're usually, the name of like a sestina or a pantoum or some comic form, some poetry forms that I've used, and that's included in the title of the comic usually. So you know what you're getting into. But then that just becomes kind of a form. I mean, you do that in poetry too. There's this element of genre as well, like a novella versus a novel and things like that.
I wonder how much of the impulse for people to hide it is this notion that it might be kind of a crutch that they're falling back on, or whether it's just a concern of people being too hyper aware of it while reading it, and that sort of detracting from the text itself.
Yeah, I think it depends on writer, but I suspect more the latter. That I don't think anyone really, if you've done some writing or creating of any sort, even if you've never heard of Oulipo and all these authors I'm talking about right now are new to you, you've probably had that experience where you're like trying to come up with an idea and you just come with some limiting structure. Sometimes even just saying it's going to be one page long. I'm not going to let myself go over a page. It's something as simple as that can really focus you and bring out ideas that you didn't know you were able to fit into one page,
The tyranny of the blank page.
Yeah, exactly. Giving yourself a starting point. That's totally legit. And if that's all people do with a constraint, then they're already getting a lot out of it. And maybe there's a sense then they're like, oh, well, that makes it kind of a creative writing class exercise. That doesn't really work as a finished work of art. To me, that's just a matter of, keeping it going and editing. And it's it runs parallel to the idea of whether it's an exercise or not. But I do think the second thing you said, that the effect that like some writers who use a lot of constraints in their writing might feel like, well, they don't want to foreground that. They want to sort of use that as a way to generate these ideas and then, but have the book stand on its own. And again, I find myself sort of in the middle, because one thing I'd like to do in the coming few years is put out a collection of the shorter constrained comics I've done. People I've talked to is like, oh yeah, it should be like constrained comics by Matt Madden, and each one will have like an explanation of each constraint going into it and have, I don't know, like a teacher's guide and stuff like that. And I see the value of that both commercially and also practically, because I think my stuff works well in the classroom. But I also, part of me is also like, yeah, but this is, when it comes down to it, these are not, again, like with the Scott McCloud thing, I'm not a pedagogical writer. I'm a cartoonist. I want to tell stories. I want to create worlds that people enter. And even if I'm waving my hand in your face the whole time saying, hey, this is fake, this is lines on paper, I still want you to get in there and have fun, So fortunately now we have PDFs and online stuff. So I could do a book that'd be very much just like short comics by Matt Madden. But then, when I'm selling it, there's also like material you can get if you're a teacher or whatever, and talk about the constraints in a expanded context of the book, I guess.
I had heard an interview that you did, and you mentioned Honor Winter's Night, a Traveler by Italo Calvino. And I probably, like a lot of people who have read that book over the past, half century, did so in the context of a creative writing class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's very canonical in that sense. Yeah.
It is an exercise, and it does sort of, at the very least, it sort of potentially points people in a direction.
Sure. Yeah, and it was more than anything else the direct inspiration for Ex Libris. I mean, it was reading that book, which ironically I didn't read in college, but I read later on. But that the characteristic of being more than one thing at once, having these kind of pastiches of different kinds of novels where you only read the first chapter, interspersed with these kind of more almost like police procedural or mystery novel chapters where you're addressed in the second person, which I didn't even think about at the time, but it probably has something to do with why I use the first person approach for the sort of framing story in Ex Libris. You're trying to solve the mystery of why you can't find the actual authentic copy of Italo Calvino's new novel, If On Winter's Night, a Traveler.
It's second person, right?
It's second person, where it's saying you are the reader, and it sort of, yeah. So there's an author. So it's, but in the sense of not just being a third person, like an omniscient kind of thing. It has a more intimate kind of engagement with the reader. That's very true. And, I wonder, doing a book like this right now, the other thing is that Calvino was really huge in like the 70s, and all that's the sort of fabulous fiction and postmodern fiction, metafiction. It's not exactly in fashion right now. And I'm curious to see with this book coming out, how people will take it. There's definitely the people who get it right away. They're like, oh yeah, I read that book, like you, like I read in college, or I love Calvino, or I love Oulipo, and they get right in the pocket with it. But there are certainly a lot of readers out there now who I think are more used to more straightforward narrative. We're living in the age of the memoir and the nonfiction comic, and there's a bit less of the kind of a fanciful, purely fictional, experimental work coming out in the indie comics world right now. So yeah, we'll see. I mean, so the initial reactions have been really good. I mean, I've gotten good reviews from, PW and Library Journal, and the few friends of mine that have read it have tended to really like it. Of course, they're my friends, so they tend to like Italo Calvino as well. So,
it's a writerly book. And so I think it's something that attracts writers, which, that's a great demographic to go after in the graphic novel world.
It's a writerly and I'm not sure what the cartoonist equivalent of that would be, a cartoonisty book, because it's also, the sweet spot is somebody who's into kind of world fiction and experimental fiction, but also like a big comics reader, because I cover everything from, Rodolphe Töpfer to Condorito's, coloring method and plot takes at the end, all kinds of stuff from the history of comics and like riffs on different artists and genres and styles and stuff. So, my dad, who's, I've been a cartoonist for, 30 years now, and he's read a lot of comics that I've shown him and stuff, but he keeps on sending me texts saying like, I want to talk to you about your new book, but I I just can't seem to make quite sense of what's going on yet. He only has the advanced reader's copy, which is we did a little galley that's in black and white. So he should probably wait to read the big version.
What's your sense of what he can't quite grasp?
My hunch is that has to do with the basic language of comics, which is another kind of open question about putting this book out in larger worlds. It's I tried to make it very accessible and clear reading as a comic, but I've become aware, especially as a teacher over the years, that reading comics isn't as easy and straightforward as it looks to some people. People tend to, it's sort of a classic teacher thing of people dismissing comics as not being sophisticated enough. But there's a lot that goes into parsing how panels sit together, how you, relate images to text, and especially when you start adding layers of different information into one panel or one page. And I suspect that's part of the hang up where I have a lot of stuff of jumping from one comic to another. And sometimes I do it by, sort of in a very classical way where I'll show the hand turning the page and you see them opening a book. Okay, now we're reading a new comic. But as I kind of hope to sort of train the reader as I go along, that this is a thing that happened in this book. This reader, the character in this room is picking up, books and sometimes just looking at one panel and putting it down again. And the book would have been twice as long if every time that happened, I did a little 4-panel sequence of like, okay, here's the hand taking the book off the shelf, opening it up to whatever page, closing it. So there's a lot of elision of that kind of stuff. And so it's a bit more telegraphic. And I think it's pretty clear. I think, if you read it, you kind of understand that. But, someone like my dad who's older and has never been a big comics reader, maybe it's a step too far. I don't know.
As I think you alluded to, the sort of central character is really a surrogate for the reader themselves, and having a character that just completely fades into the background almost immediately is probably adds to the difficulty in sort of contextualizing this.
Yeah, possibly. It's funny, this book has been kicking around for a long time. I probably first had the idea, in possibly even in the late 90s, before I did 99 Ways. And it was something that I sat on for a long time, partly because I wasn't sure if it's something that I could pull off. And partly was that idea that like, well, I was really wary about doing a first person narrative because, I'm a big film buff and everyone knows that Orson Welles tried to, after Citizen Kane, he famously tried to make a first person version of Heart of Darkness and he shot some test footage and he gave up. He's like, I can't do this. This is too difficult.
If Orson Welles can't do it, then...
Exactly. If Orson Welles can't do it. So I had that in mind. And I was like, do I really want to try this? And I was looking around. I haven't seen a lot of other comics that do that. But in the intervening, 20 years, video games have become so prevalent and the first person shooter and kind of first person point of view in like, Minecraft and Roblox or whatever that my kids play all the time has become so comfortable and prevalent and kind of transparent that I feel like when I look at it now and when I showed it to some readers earlier on, like, what do you think about the first person thing? People have generally been like, oh, it's fine. I didn't really notice it. It puts the burden of any kind of character development or psychological or backstory on the voiceover narration, which is another thing, which, it's not my favorite thing. I've tried a bunch of my comics have no narration at all. I try to limit the text, and I did a lot of editing, especially as I got toward the end of this, to really keep it to a minimum. But I also didn't want to have the character actually speaking like a one person play kind of thing, like speaking in word balloon. I thought that would be even more not alienating, but off-putting. I decided just like sticking with that. The voiceover narration was a more direct way to have that rapport and just like a smoothness of the reading experience where you're reading kind of the what's going on in their head and seeing what they're seeing.
How much has this evolved and what did this look like, 20 years ago when you first hit on the idea?
The basic narrative structure was in there pretty early on. Like I knew that I wanted to have, that it was kind of like Repulsion or The Tenant, the Polanski movie. And more recently I read the French novel that The Tenant is based on which is by Roland Topor, who is the artist on that Fantastic Planet animated sci-fi movie, is what he's best known for in the US, but really good artist and novelist. These stories where it creates this, and almost like a Samuel Beckett kind of thing, like a character stuck in a room, and how are they going to get out of the room? There's some kind of like psychic force, or what's that Buñuel movie where all the dinner guests are afraid none of them can be the first one to leave the party at the end of the night. I knew that I wanted to have this setup of a situation of a character that were and from the get-go, for whatever reason, I knew I wanted it to be first person. I wanted to like you to be in the room and really focus on the books, like be because I also like comics with no people in them. Like Martin Von James's book, The Cage, is a famous example. I remember Al Columbia did a short comic that we put in Best American Comics a few years ago. There was sort of a murder mystery, but it's mostly just shots of really detailed shots of close-ups of different parts of an apartment. And you'll see like there's a little bit of coiled rope in a corner. There's a spot of blood on the sofa. And at the very end, almost incidentally, there's like a choked old lady in the corner.
We talked about sort of like, the potential alienation of removing the protagonist, but that is that's taking it to its logical extreme of just removing people altogether. In a sense, you are kind of robbing people of an easy entry point.
Yeah, well, I mean, the cage is definitely the ultimate case of that because there's not even any suggestion of human characters in that. It really is exploring a space, and it's a very anti-narrative kind of thing. In the this Al Columbia piece, it's like almost like a crime scene photo kind of thing or a Ouija sort of setup. And in my book, there's a character there, and we see their hand. So there's actually someone very present the whole time. You're just not. You're seeing things through their eyes and not getting to see what they're doing, and until well, I don't want to get into spoilers here, but that basic idea was in there from the get go, and that I was going to have this character in a room full of comic books. This idea that they would start to feel like they couldn't leave the room until they'd sort of solved the mystery of what these comic books are there for. There's definitely a movement of like starting to see. Getting a sense that there's hidden messages in the comics that are possibly directed towards the reader of the book, and an increasing amount of paranoia. So that was sort of like that basic structure was in place early on. It took a long time to work out the sort of beat by beat details to where I felt like it was ready to be a full length book work. Like for a long time I thought it might be a short story, and it's not a very long. It's like 120 pages as a full book with the chapter breaks and everything. So it's not a super long. I think of it kind of a novella or like a long short story. But a lot of it was in there from the beginning, like the image of the spiral rug, which is a leitmotif throughout the book and which is the first panel of the book, is something that came to me pretty early on. And I don't remember why, but I instantly connected it to the Ex Libris project of like this idea of entering this room, you're crossing this threshold, and the lines all get messed up, and your sense of perspective gets shifted in some irrevocable way until you actually leave the room again. And then I had a lot of stories. Some of the stories that are in the book have been around for a long time, like the Man Who Forgot Time and the Mulata of Cordoba, which is in the last chapter. Some of these stories I'd written quite a while ago, and I liked them, and I also saw that they had this thread to them about something about blurring the lines between fiction and reality, between art and real life, between the creator and the viewer. And so it seemed to make sense to weave those into a longer narrative. And there's frankly a practical aspect to that where it's like it's really hard to sell a short story collection. People, short stories are my favorite form. It's where I feel, most comfortable. Part of me still dreams of someday doing a really long graphic novel, but I'm not really sure I have it into me. I feel like what I'm best at is a sort of 8 to 20 page range story. And so that's another way I conceived of this book is like, how can I link together a series of stories in a way that doesn't just feel like a kind of omnibus with like a, night gallery host or whatever, but like a real story, but that uses these pieces as part of a developing narrative, mounting tension and, surprise.
As you say it, I wonder if the rug specifically serves as an anchor for the reader, sort of a landmark for them in the sense that you feel like you're kind of throwing them into this first person perspective, but also asking them to do the somewhat heavy lifting of jumping from text to text and attempting to forge a bridging narrative between them. You at least have this object that you can keep coming back to that will give you some semblance of direction.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. I definitely, as I was working, that's one of those things that came out of the process of working on it. I definitely started to realize like I really, every few pages where I can, need to fit that rug in there. Yeah, it's like a sort of anchor that guides you through. and also reminds you of this weird condition of this room, that as long as the reader is in this room, they're on this kind of weird distorted rug that's never quite in the right perspective. And then it's also a reminder of, so it's a reminder of that skewed perspective. It's a reminder of the fact that you're in this little room where you can never even really get a view of the whole rug. It's usually like a little section of it that you see. And it's a spiral. So that's obviously associated with delirium and with dreams and stuff like that. So I worked that into the stories in various ways, like when the reader gets really drunk at one point and the looks at the rug through an empty tequila bottle. And so then at that point, the sort of squared off maze-like spiral turns into an actual circular spiral. So that also gave me something to work with, because it's a challenge. And that's one aspect of constraint of doing a comic like this, is how many things could I do where all I have to work with is a bookcase, a futon, and this rug. That's like, and a door. There are very few props to play around with, limited angles that I can show. So yeah, it became very useful. And yeah, we'll have to see what readers say when people start reading it and responding to it, what the role of that little recurring leitmotif is.
This is like very zeitgeisty to say, but it's a liminal zone. The framing device itself is really, more than anything, is kind of the space in between the books.
Yeah. There you go.
Do you abandon ideas a lot? When you do sort of start to sit down and work on something in earnest, do you tend to generally work all the way through?
No, absolutely. I abandon stuff all the time. And that's, I think, one reason it's taken me so long to get a full book out of comics is that 99 Ways to Tell a Story came out in 2005. And granted, a bunch of other stuff happened. We had 2 children. We wrote 2 textbooks together. We were series editors of the Best American Comics for 6 years. We moved to France for 4 years. And in that time, I was, once I finished 99 Ways, I really wanted to concentrate on doing short stories using constraints. I've done a bunch of them, published in random small places that even my closest readers, I doubt, have read all this stuff. But on top of all that, I did have plans to do like a longer, some kind of book length project. And I started various things. And I was, I was even mindful of the fact that I was so busy, that I was a father. I was teaching at SVA at the time, and had downtime in cafes in Manhattan. So I devised these systems where I had like a comic that was only going to be drawn on little, index card size panels, so I could be modular and I could just have it in my backpack. And I had 2 projects like that I worked pretty seriously on over the course of 3 or 4 years. And for different reasons, both of them, I just, they just kind of petered out. And I was like, and several smaller ones too, where I was like, I'd pull out some sketches every once in a while and bang my head against them. And eventually just decide to move on, which is not to say they'll never come back to them. Even, one of those things I put aside, I actually, dusted off just recently and started looking at it with fresh eyes. And I was like, I think I might be able to take another whack at this. I think there are very few projects that you can't do if you devote yourself to it and are ready to, sweat some blood. It's just a matter of what hill you plant your flag on in that sense. So Reading Room could easily have been one of those projects. It's been, I'm calling it in its old name, its working title. Ex Libris was called The Reading Room for a long time. And it was just kind of this thing. It was like, yeah, I like it, but can I really pull it off in a way that other people will get something out of it? And I wasn't sure. But when I decided pretty recently in the second half of our residency in Angoulême, I was like, time's running out here. I really need to commit to something, have a project, and make it a book. And I chose Libris. And once I did that, went through the notes I had, which I had a lot, and I had thumbnails for various scenes, I kind of sat down. I was like, all right, there's enough here to work on. This is what I'm doing now. And from that point on, it was pretty smooth sailing. It was a lot of work, and I did some rewrites and had my dark nights of the soul about the whole thing, not working at all. But basically, I hit that bump, crossed that valley. Jessica calls it the dark forest, which was, I think she got that idea from Ira Glass. This idea of in any creative project, you reach this point where you're just wandering in in the dark, in the Schwarzwald, and you're disoriented and you feel like you're never going to get out. But all you can do is just keep going and plodding away, and eventually you usually come out the other end. So, but yeah, plenty of abandoned projects behind me and plenty to be abandoned in the future, I'm sure.
I like the use of the term modular. I write about tech for a living, so that's something that that we talk about a lot in terms of modular hardware. But it's an interesting idea in terms of stories that you can plug in. Now, certainly, working on a large project seems insurmountable because we're really just kind of looking at the finish line, and we're calculating the amount of time and the amount of sweat that it'll take to get there. If you can break it up into smaller pieces, it's a lot easier. And I look at something like Ex Libris. It does feel modular. It does feel like something that you could have and probably did work in chunks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm very into thinking about things in chunks. I'm a big, getting things done guy, and I have my whole, process for breaking projects into little pieces as possible. And that definitely helped me to get a grip on Ex Libris. Same thing for 99 Ways to Tell a Story. It was that was a fun project to work on because it was always so straightforward. It's like, all right, one more, same story, do it again. What are my choices? Go through my list, pick one that works, let's keep going. The one downside or other, context in terms of a book like Ex Libris and also 99 Ways, and a lot of my work, unfortunately, is that because there are so many different types of stories and types of drawing in there, I'm often losing hours, days, sometimes weeks, reinventing the wheel because I've decided that this one page, I'm going to draw it like it's a imaginary, 18th century, slave narrative done in some kind of imaginary linoprint technology. And I'm going to try and reproduce that, in pen and ink. And I do a lot of research online and, do a lot of sketches and stuff. In that sense, I look at artists who have just the way they draw, and they were able to just start working on a book and plow through from beginning to end. And I dream of doing that one day, but I'm not sure it'll ever happen because I'm always drawn by that plastic possibility of comics more than any other medium to really pull the rug out from under the reader at any time by introducing color, introducing a different drawing style, changing the panel shape or size. There's just so much fun stuff you can do with that I always find myself being pulled in that direction. So
I was thinking a lot about Bob Skoriak's work as I was reading this in terms of instead of the medium being the message, almost the style being the message, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
The sort of genre or the artist that he's taking on, really telling the story. And when I think about him and the sort of the very specific niche that he's carved out for himself in the comics world, it either seems like the best job in comics or the worst job in comics, and I can't really figure out which.
I think he's very happy with it. I think we're very simpatico, definitely, and we share that aspect of using a different kind of constraint where and seeing the pleasure and richness in appropriating kind of traditional drawing styles. But he does it more whole hog. I'll use it in Ex Libris. There's a Tales from the Crypt parody. There's some kind of Hanna-Barbera animal cartoon stuff in there, but just little dribs and drabs. But he really and what's fun to do that is to see how you use the particular conventions of a given style, like Tales from the Crypt, which he's also played around with, of course. You have the garish colors. You also have the completely overdone narration with all the cheesy alliteration and stuff. There's a lot of fun to riff on, and the various Jack Davis, Bernie Wrightson, all the different artists that worked on those books that you can kind of riff on in different ways. What's different about him is that he's really taken it and really considers it as a kind of life's conceptual artwork project, kind of like On Kawara, the conceptual painter who just painted a black canvas with the day's date in white, and then included a newspaper in the back and then sealed it up, for his whole life for something like 70 years. That's kind of how Bob sees his comics project. So I've talked to him about it before and so what are you going to do next? You have some other, kind of stuff you're going to play around with or, and he's like, no, I just have so many ideas. I have so much fun doing this particular thing of, doing these mashups of the drawing styles and the literary works. And I can see why, because it's there's just so much richness to be found the more you dig into the particularities of a given work of literature, whether it's, Scarlet Letter or the Constitution, and then a given popular comic book style or artist, you just find all these little resonances that you can tweak. I remember Scarlet Letter was done in Little Lulu style. And there's this little thing, which I guess they use I haven't read a ton of Little Lulu, but there's a thing, I guess, when the kids are stunned or something, there's a triangle of 3 dots in front of that kind of floats above them.
Almost like the drunk kind of.
Yeah, it's almost kind of like a delirious kind of thing. And Bob uses that brilliantly in that Scarlet Letter thing to kind of express this sort of like existential unease of the characters. So yeah, it's a real deep dive for him.
I suspect that part of why you're drawn to experimenting with different styles is really pragmatically, it's just a way of keeping yourself engaged.
Exactly. Yeah. It keeps me excited. That's why it keeps on drawing me back. And I would have to hit on a way of drawing. And I definitely experimented with it, like in Bridge. I don't know if you got the mini couche that I did. That one is it's a 24-page story. So it's like, all right, I'm going to really work on just having a pretty simple style that I'm happy with, that I can imagine developing and for longer work. And I could see some stuff there where, like, given the right project, I might be able to do that. And I'm curious to see if I was able to adopt something like that, if I would suddenly turn into Louis Trondheim, although I suspect not. But he's one of those guys, like him and like Jason, certain artists who have this sort of style that's almost like it's like a mental stencil. They can just like crank it out and they just, and which is not to take away from it, because they do very rich things, and both of them work in different genres and have these whole worlds that are very distinct.
They're iconic. I mean, they're immediately, the second you see one of their panels that it's
right. Which is another advantage, because I do feel like I've probably suffered over the years from not having a recognizable style. Like, if I do have a style. Like, I used to be surprised when people say, like, "Oh, I could tell that was your drawing." Even in my early mini comics, when I didn't even know how to draw yet. But we all have style. There's something in the way, in the physiological way that you hold a pen in your hand. That Gary Panter has that ratty line, because that's just the way his hand works. Partly it's his theory and like being influenced by the teachers he had and by pop art, but it's also just the way his hand goes. My earliest comics mentors were Terry Laban, who used to do Unsupervised Existence and Cud, and Matt Fazell, who did the amazing Cynical Man mini comics. And when Matt would go to comics conventions, he would always have like a bulletin board behind him with Post-its. And if you came up, you could take a Post-it and you could draw his Cynical Man character, which you've never seen. Is like, it's literally just a circle with 2 dots for eyes and a line. And the only thing that makes it a character is that the line goes out one side of the circle of the head. That's sort of the Cynical Man look. And then a line for the body. And if you drew that on a Post-it, he would stick it on the wall and he would give you a free mini comic. It was a really cool thing that he did, sort of like a community thing. A lot of young people would do it. But what was remarkable is at the end of the show, I'd come over to his table and there'd be 50 Cynical Man drawings, these very simple stickman drawings. And none of them looked like Cynical Man, because none of them were drawn by Matt. The weight, the line weight, the little flick of his hand when he picks up the pen, the way those 2 dots are, as simple as that is, it's a very iconic drawing. I think that's a real lesson to me about how much each artist has a style, whether they think they do or want to or not. I was going to say about the tedium of drawing over and over again. I mean, I remember a conversation with an artist friend who was a very good art. He did sort of like ink drawings with wash and stuff, and they were kind of comicsy, and he liked comics. We talked about comics a lot, but at one time he said, he's like, I just don't know how you do it. I can't imagine drawing the same character over and over again. I can't do it. It's definitely like there's a certain temperament and approach to the idea of what you're doing, and the sanctity or non-sanctity of a particular image that you just trace it and draw it again.
I've talked to Bob about this a number of times over the years, and I'm trying to remember what his take on it was, but he had a style, I think, before he hit on the work that he's doing now. Now, it sounds like your definition of your style isn't so much a specific trademark aesthetic, but rather something that that works across all of these different styles that you're working in, something that kind of unites them. I mean, in that sense, are you almost actively working against your own style when you're trying to work in different milieus?
To some degree, maybe. I mean, I think 2 things about my style. One is that there is that basic, just like there's a hand in it, where like now where I see a drawing I did with a nib pen or with a brush, and I can see the similar characteristics to just the way I bear down on the tool and the kind of line it makes and the kind of shapes I create. But at the same time, I've seen over time that what people react to most in the drawings and the comics I've done in the past is when I do a thicker brushy ink line, like I did in my first book, Black Candy, and I've done come back to in short stories sometimes Drawn Onward has that as kind of part of there's sort of two, again, there's two styles in that book, as a sort of framing story drawn with a very clean pen line, and then the sort of comic within a comic that is done really thick brush lines. And I like doing that, and it definitely is. It's the drawings of mine that get most response have that kind of look. I can't exactly say why I've shied away from it. I guess to some extent, I know I'll never be able to wield a brush like Edmond Baudouin or Bluch, or with that kind of looseness. Aristophanes, who I translated, Zabim sisters, or on the other hand, like Dan Clowes or Charles Burns have that incredible control. There's always definitely one quality of my style is like I'm not a very steady drawer up close. So there's a little bit of shying away from that mantle, and a little bit of like feeling like trying to find. I don't think my stuff is cold. I think there's actually it pleases me a lot in reviews of my work that even though like Comic Scholar and Matt Madden and Ubapo and France and all this stuff, but very often people do see a warmth in the stories that I'm telling that sort of comes through at the same time as I'm playing around with sort of more conceptual ideas and playing with being very formalist and stuff. But I wouldn't say I'm an emo cartoonist. I'm not very the emotions in there, but like brush is very expressionistic. I guess that's what it comes down to. And I kind of go back and forth. I find myself in the middle of these things more often than not, where I'm always kind of vacillating to one side or the other. Because I look at someone like Richard McGuire or, Ivan Brunetti's more, mature style, where it's like a very clean, cool, modernist kind of simple style. I really admire that, and I often think like that's the style I need. That's going to solve all my conundrums. But it's not really. I haven't really found that in my own drawing. It's something I want to draw like Saul Steinberg. By the time I'm like 80 years old, I want to be drawing like Saul Steinberg. But it's a process. It's very slow.
There's a Chris Ware sketchbook, and in it he just writes, I think in the middle of the page, he just writes, like, I wish I could draw like Gary Panter. And I think about that a lot because I think that there's this impulse amongst the most meticulous artists to just want to feel freer in their style.
Yeah, to fuck shit up. Yeah, I remember, speaking to like Charles Burns, I loved finding years ago, they put out a collection. I guess he's got his free shit stuff is out now, but there was a book, like just sketchbook stuff. There was like Kitchen Sink Press. It was back in like the early 90s, I think. It was so cool to see his style. And again, it's very clearly Charles Burns. There's no mistaking it, but little scribbly drawings done with like a ballpoint pen, and seeing that very different vital effects, was always very cool. So I like seeing people mix it up that way. I'd love to see a sloppy Jaime Hernandez drawing, make him work with like in like dry brush and with like charcoal or something like that.
You almost wonder if he can at this point, just because he's been doing what he does for so long.
No, it becomes a thing that's very hard to get out of, and artists struggle with it to varying degrees. I think there's a curse of virtuosity, which I'm blessedly free of, but that you see in Chris Ware's rank, self-doubt in his sketchbooks. I know like Roman Muradov is always complaining about that on his Instagram and stuff, that he almost can't help but make something look really charming and pretty, and he's always trying to make it look more alienating and weird, which he certainly succeeds in his storytelling, but the drawing is always like, even his messiest drawings have this kind of panache to them. And I think it really annoys him. He's like, why am I so good and facile? Why can't I do something awkward? I think about this a lot, looking at the current landscape of American indie comics, really world comics. But, I was gone after doing the Best American Comics for years. I was pretty burnt out. And we moved to France. So I kind of like dropped out of the American comic scene for several years. And there's all these new people, doing amazing stuff. And it's very much, kind of under the sway or a kind of a generational shift that can be traced back to Gary, but like, Fort Thunder and CF and stuff that's coming over from Europe, and then the technology of the risograph and also, Adventure Time and some stuff that's going on in animation that is this whole total shift in the way comics are drawn. Like when I was discovering indie comics in the late 80s at Dave's Comics in Ann Arbor, the stuff that was weird and cool was like Dan Clowes, the Hernandez brothers, and there was stuff like Pete Bagg that was like more cartoony, but it was still very much there was like there was a certain ethic to American indie comics of like, clean pages, nice looking art, it might be crazy stuff going on, but it was like very carefully put together.
They had something to prove, I think, they had to prove that they were professionals.
It's hard to remember. I mean, it's such a different context back then. And I think, where did I see? I saw an interview with someone else remarking that from my generation, even older, like looking at these younger cartoonists who were just like working in pencil or just doing it in Procreate and, collaging in colors and printing it in risograph with, and putting out tons of stuff. And it was someone like, might have been Durf or someone like that, has very, pattern heavy, I'm really glad I didn't commit to like being a heavy crosshatch cartoonist as a young guy. Cause I'm slow enough just doing pretty like line art with black spotting. But he was remarking sort of admiringly of like the younger generation, like, oh yeah, they're not so caught up in like proving that they can do, modeled cross hatching and stuff like that. It's a shift. And it's also a cycle. Like these things, come in and out of style. Cause of course, Gary was doing this stuff before this all started. But I was thinking about, in this context, I was thinking about Ron Ricci's work and how incredibly original, even more back then. Like I think even now Ron's stuff is kind of like sui generis, but in 1995 or whatever, when the Dum Dum book came out, there was like just very little else out in the world that looked like that in comics, and now there's definitely like a mainstream of like weird art, where like I go to a comic book store that has a lot of great art comics, and I am very impressed. And there's lots of invention there, but I do start to see like, oh, I see this sort of, there's a lineage here that goes back to, to Fort Thunder, or this one, they've been studying manga and Adventure Time, and they're fusing that together. There's like new kind of traditions forming, which, 10, 15 years from now are also going to seem kind of hoary and out of fashion, but then they'll come back and it goes in a cycle. That's my hope, obviously, because this gets back to this book that I'm doing, where it's like I already said, kind of metafiction and Calvino and stuff is not particularly in fashion. I don't think it's canceled or anything either. It's just not something that people. It's not really in the zeitgeist, and I feel that way about the way most of the drawing I do. Like I was sort of surveying. I have like tons of different styles in the book, but I look at it. I have to admit, like, well, it still sticks within that range of my generation's kind of classic sense of like, from newspaper comics to Chris Ware, basically that sort of range. I hope people will still like it and find the appeal of whatever style it's drawn in.